Herman Harry Jenkins, a 73-year-old Vietnam veteran, boarded a tour bus to the Grand Canyon with nothing but excitement and hope in his heart. For decades, he had dreamed of standing at the edge of one of nature's greatest wonders, a moment of peace to honor a life filled with battles both on and off the field. But what began as a journey to fulfill a lifelong dream quickly spiraled into a nightmare. A dismissive tour guide, subtle but painful prejudice, and then the unthinkable, a confrontation with a rogue police officer that left Harry teetering on the very edge of the canyon, his life hanging by a thread. What happened next would shock everyone present and ignite a nationwide demand for justice. This is a story of quiet resilience colliding with blatant injustice, a story where one man's courage, in the face of overwhelming odds, inspired millions to stand up and speak out. Before we dive deep into this gripping story of bravery, injustice, and redemption, comment below where you're watching from today. And if you're moved by this powerful journey of resilience, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. You won't want to miss the incredible stories we have lined up next. Herman Harry Jenkins, a 73-year-old retired Marine and Vietnam veteran, sat quietly in his humble living room. The afternoon sun filtered through the curtains, casting warm golden rays on the walls, where relics of his long life hung like milestones frozen in time. Framed photographs of a younger Harry in his crisp military uniform decorated the room, alongside medals of valor and certificates that chronicled his service to his country. Harry's eyes lingered on a particular photograph, his unit standing together, smiling after a hard-fought mission deep in the jungles of Southeast Asia. Though decades had passed, the memories felt as fresh as the sharp, damp air of those distant battlefields. Now, at 73, his strong frame had yielded to the passage of time, though his spirit remained unyielded. For as long as he could remember, Harry had dreamed of visiting the Grand Canyon. To him, it was more than just a landmark. It was a symbol of resilience and timeless strength, qualities he prided himself on. Throughout his military career and the struggles of civilian life afterward, the vision of standing on the canyon's edge stayed with him, like a promise to himself. Yet life, as it often does, had a way of placing obstacles in his path: deployments, family responsibilities, and financial hardships. But now, with his children growing up and his health still stable, Harry resolved that it was finally time to see the majestic landscape that had always been called to him. With careful planning, Harry booked a seat on a guided tour, using his modest savings to secure the trip. He spent the following days preparing for the journey, dusting off his sturdy boots, packing a bag with essentials, and rehearsing what he would say if asked about his medals or service. His excitement was tempered with a quiet humility. This journey wasn't about recognition, but about peace and closure. The morning of his departure was unusually crisp for early autumn. Harry arrived at the travel agency early, the collar of his well-worn jacket turned up against the chill. As he entered, the faint scent of stale coffee and cheap air freshener greeted him. Behind the counter stood a middle-aged man whose name tag read Brian. Brian's wrinkled shirt and disinterested demeanor suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. "Name?" Brian asked curtly, barely glancing up from his computer. "Herman Jenkins," Harry replied, handing over his printed confirmation slip. Brian scanned the paper with the efficiency of someone who'd done this far too many times. He frowned slightly before tapping at the keyboard. "Seat 26, he muttered. "Back of the bus." Harry hesitated. "I was hoping for a window seat," he said politely. "I booked this months ago, and I'd like to enjoy the view." Without bothering to look up, Brian shrugged dismissively. "All the good seats are taken. You can either take what you've got or wait for the next trip. Your choice." Harry clenched his jaw, his patience tested but intact. He had faced far worse during his lifetime than an unfriendly clerk. With a nod, he replied evenly, "That's fine. I'll take seat 26. The tour bus idled outside, its engine emitting a low rumble as passengers began to board. Harry noticed a young driver with short blonde hair chatting animatedly with a few tourists near the door. They laughed and exchanged pleasantries, their voices filled with excitement. As Harry approached, he offered the driver a polite nod, but she barely acknowledged him before turning back to her conversation. Climbing aboard, Harry made his way to the back of the bus, where he found his assigned seat. The window next to him was smudged, and the cushion was noticeably worn. But he settled in without complaint. Around him, other passengers began filling the seats. Harry couldn't help but notice that most of the front row seats were occupied by white tourists, while the back rows were predominantly filled with people of color. It wasn't the first time he'd seen such a silent segregation, but it still stung. He thought back to his time in the military, where camaraderie often transcended racial lines in the face of shared danger. It was disheartening to see that civilian life hadn't evolved as far as he'd hoped. As the bus pulled away, the tour guide, a man named Roger, introduced himself over the intercom. Roger's tone was upbeat, almost overly enthusiastic, as he described the itinerary for the day. But Harry quickly noticed that Roger's cheerful demeanor seemed reserved for the passengers in the front rows. Whenever someone in the back attempted to ask a question, Roger's responses were either dismissive or non-existent. Harry leaned back in his seat, his gaze shifting to the desert scenery outside. He reminded himself that this trip wasn't about the people around him or even the tour itself. It was about fulfilling a promise he had made to himself all those years ago. Still, the sting of exclusion lingered like an unwelcome shadow on what should have been a joyous occasion. By the time the bus made its first rest stop, Harry stepped off to stretch his legs, savoring the crisp desert air. He scanned the group of tourists milling about and caught sight of a young black man adjusting a camera on a tripod. Intrigued, Harry approached him, offering a small smile. "Nice setup you've got there," Harry said, nodding toward the camera. The young man turned, smiling warmly. "Thanks. I'm a journalist, and my name is Elijah Brooks, working on a piece about hidden stories in the desert." "You here for the tour?" "Sure am," Harry replied. "Been waiting years to see the Grand Canyon." Elijah's eyes lit up. "You've got to have some stories to tell then," Harry chuckled softly. "Plenty of stories, but this trip's not about the past. It's about seeing something beautiful." Elijah nodded thoughtfully, his enthusiasm infectious. For the first time since the trip began, Harry felt a genuine connection, a spark of humanity amidst the indifference. As the journey continued, the sense of indifference Harry had encountered earlier grew heavier. Back on the bus, he returned to his seat in the farthest row. The window still bore its streaked imperfections, muting the sunlight and his view of the sweeping desert landscape outside. Roger, the tour guide, resumed his energetic monologue over the intercom, directing his attention almost exclusively to the front row passengers. Harry tried not to let it bother him, but the imbalance was glaring. Questions from the passengers up front were met with warmth and detailed answers, while the voices from the back row, if acknowledged at all, were brushed aside with perfunctory responses. "Where did you say that trail leads?" someone from Harry's row asked. Roger gave a half-turn, his expression betraying mild annoyance. "Oh, it's just another path," he said curtly before launching into a more enthusiastic explanation of a point of interest for the front rows. Harry leaned back, his hands resting on his lap as he gazed out the window. He told himself, "I'm here for the canyon, not for their approval." But no matter how much he tried to focus on the grandeur of the destination, the treatment gnawed at him. His lifetime of patience and resilience dulled the sting, but it didn't erase it. The bus made another stop about an hour later, this time at a scenic overlook. Passengers disembarked eagerly, cameras in hand, as they fanned out to take photos. The sight of the open desert under the broad blue sky was undeniably beautiful. Harry lingered near the bus for a moment, breathing in the dry, earthy air before wandering toward the edge of the group. He spotted Elijah again, crouched near a cluster of rocks with his camera in hand, snapping photos of a desert flower blooming amidst the rugged terrain. Curious, Harry approached. "You've got a good eye," Harry remarked, his voice steady but warm. Elijah glanced up, flashing a quick smile. "Thanks. There's beauty in the little things, you know? Even out here in what looks like emptiness." Harry nodded, appreciating the young man's perspective. "Not much is truly empty. You just have to look hard enough to see what's there." The two fell into easy conversation. Elijah asked Harry about his reasons for taking the trip, and Harry shared a bit about his lifelong dream of seeing the Grand Canyon. In return, Elijah spoke of his passion for storytelling and capturing the hidden narratives of everyday people. As they talked, Harry noticed subtle glances cast in their direction by some of the other tourists. A few turned away quickly when their eyes met his, while others whispered to one another. Harry had endured countless moments like this over the years, and though he chose to ignore them, the weight of such quiet judgments still pressed against his chest. Back on the bus, the dynamics of the group remained largely unchanged. Roger kept his focus on the passengers up front, regaling them with stories and trivia about the desert landscape. Harry tried to immerse himself in the scenery outside, letting his thoughts drift to the canyon that awaited him. He had waited decades for this experience, and he wouldn't let anyone ruin it. He glanced over at Elijah, who sat a few rows ahead, his camera balanced on his lap. The young man occasionally turned to offer Harry a small, reassuring nod, as if silently acknowledging the shared sense of exclusion they both felt. It was a small gesture, but it mattered. As the bus neared its final destination, the air inside grew heavy with anticipation. Roger's tone became even more animated as he described the magnificence of the Grand Canyon and what the group could expect upon arrival. Harry leaned forward slightly, catching glimpses of the horizon through the streaked window. His heart quickened with excitement. This is it, he thought, a wave of emotion washing over him. For years, he had pictured this moment, standing at the edge of the canyon, taking in its vastness and marveling at the sheer power of nature. But as they drew closer, an unease began to creep into Harry's chest. It wasn't just the dismissive treatment or the quiet stares, it was something deeper, a gut feeling that had served him well over the years. He had learned to trust his instincts, and right now, they were telling him to be on guard. Bookmark. The bus finally came to a stop in a parking lot overlooking the canyon. The passengers filed out, their voices filled with awe as they caught their first glimpse of the breathtaking vista. Harry stepped off the bus with measured steps, his knees protesting slightly as he adjusted to the uneven ground. The sight before him was everything he had imagined and more. The canyon stretched out endlessly, its layers of red, orange, and brown rock glowing under the afternoon sun. The jagged cliffs and shadowed crevices spoke of a history far older than any man-made monument, a testament to the power and beauty of the natural world. For a brief moment, Harry forgot about the indignities of the day. Standing there, gazing out at the canyon, he felt a deep sense of peace and reverence. This was why he had come, why he had endured so much. But the moment was fleeting. The chatter of the group and the ever-present feeling of being watched pulled him back to reality. As he moved to a quieter spot further down the trail, he overheard Roger making a light-hearted remark to the group. "Stay within the designated areas," Roger said with a chuckle. "We wouldn't want anyone taking an unexpected tumble." The group laughed politely, but Harry detected a faint edge of condescension in the guide's tone. Shaking off the discomfort, Harry found a secluded spot where he could admire the view in peace. But just as he was beginning to relax, the crunch of footsteps behind him shattered the tranquility. He turned to see a police officer striding toward the group, his wide-brimmed hat casting a shadow over his stern face. The officer's presence seemed to ripple through the crowd, causing conversations to hush and people to step aside. Harry's instincts sharpened. He had encountered men like this before, men who wielded their authority like a weapon. However, he stood his ground, and a cold knot formed in his stomach. The officer's gaze swept over the group, but when his eyes landed on Harry, they lingered a moment too long. This isn't going to end well, Harry thought, his muscles tensing as he braced for what was to come. The officer approached the group with a measured, authoritative stride, his name tag reading R. Wilkes. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his belt heavy with tools of enforcement, a baton, handcuffs, and a firearm that caught the sun's glare. His presence was like a storm cloud settling over the otherwise serene landscape of the canyon. "Who's in charge here?" Officer Wilkes barked, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. Roger, the tour guide, stepped forward, his usual chipper demeanor replaced with a nervous smile. "That would be me," he said, his voice a pitch higher than usual. "Is there a problem, officer?" Wilkes surveyed the group with a critical eye, but his gaze landed squarely on Harry. It lingered, piercing, filled with a suspicion that needed no explanation. Harry met his stare calmly, refusing to flinch under the weight of the unspoken accusation. "Got a report about suspicious activity in the area," Wilkes said flatly. "Thought I'd take a look." Roger's nervous chuckle was almost comical. "Oh, I'm sure it's nothing. We're just tourists enjoying the sights." Wilkes didn't acknowledge Roger's attempt to defuse the situation. Instead, he turned his full attention to Harry. "Let me see some ID," the officer demanded. A ripple of unease passed through the group. A few of the tourists exchanged uncertain glances, while others deliberately looked away, pretending to be engrossed in the view. Harry remained composed, though he felt the knot in his stomach tighten. He had dealt with moments like this before, too many to count. Slowly, he reached into his pocket, pulled out his wallet, and handed over his driver's license. Wilkes studied the ID with a frown, reading the name aloud. "Herman Jenkins," he said, his tone heavy with suspicion. "What brings you out here, Mr. Jenkins?" Harry held the officer's gaze. "Same as everyone else, officer," he said evenly. "I'm here to see the canyon." The simplicity of his answer seemed to irritate Wilkes. His lip curled slightly as though the statement itself were a challenge. "You traveling alone?" "I'm with the tour group," Harry replied, keeping his voice calm. Wilkes turned to Roger, holding up the license. "You vouching for him?" Roger hesitated, glancing nervously between Harry and the officer. "Well, he's on the list if that's what you mean." "That's not what I asked," Wilkes snapped. "I'm asking if you've seen him the whole time or if he's been wandering off." Harry clenched his fists at his sides, the tension in his chest rising. "I've been with the group the entire time," he said firmly. "You're welcome to ask anyone here." Wilkes's eyes narrowed, his tone turning icy. "Don't get smart with me, old man. I don't take kindly to attitude." Before Harry could respond, another voice broke through the tension. "Officer, is there a problem here?" Elijah stepped forward, his camera slung over his shoulder, his expression calm but resolute. His presence was a stark contrast to the rest of the group, who either stood frozen or kept their distance. Wilkes turned to face Elijah, his annoyance clear. "Stay out of this, kid. It's none of your business." "With all due respect, it is my business," Elijah said. "I'm a journalist, and I have every right to document what's happening here." The mention of journalism seemed to strike a nerve. Wilkes's hand moved instinctively to the baton at his hip. "Turn that camera off," he ordered, his voice low and menacing, "or I'll confiscate it." Elijah didn't flinch. "I haven't even turned it on yet," he said, his tone measured. "But if you keep this up, I just might." Harry's respect for the young man grew at that moment, and so did his concern. He knew how quickly situations like this could escalate. Placing a steady hand on Elijah's shoulder, Harry said quietly, "It's all right, son. I can handle this." "Yeah, listen to the old man," Wilkes sneered. "The last thing you want is to make me angry." Harry turned back to Wilkes, his voice steady but firm. "I've given you my ID. I'm part of this group. Now, unless you have something else, I'd like to enjoy my day." For a moment it seemed like Wilkes might back down. But then his expression darkened, and he stepped closer to Harry, invading his personal space. "You think you can talk to me like that?" Wilkes said, his voice low and threatening. "You think your age or your stories make you special?" Harry held his ground, though his heart pounded in his chest. "I think you've got no reason to bother me, officer," he said calmly. "And I think you know it." The tension was suffocating. Around them, the other tourists stood frozen, unsure whether to intervene or retreat. Even the vast, timeless canyon seemed muted under the weight of the confrontation. Then, without warning, Wilkes shoved Harry hard in the chest. The sudden force sent Harry stumbling backward, his boots skidding on the loose gravel near the edge of the canyon. Gasps erupted from the onlookers, but no one moved to help. Elijah's hand darted to his camera, his instincts taking over as he began recording. "Back away," Wilkes barked, his voice booming across the canyon. "I won't tolerate defiance." Harry's heels teetered dangerously close to the edge, but he managed to regain his balance. His chest heaved as he steadied himself, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "You're making a mistake," Harry said, his voice calm despite the chaos. "I don't want trouble," Wilkes sneered. "Too late for that. You've already made this personal." With a sudden, forceful grip, Wilkes grabbed Harry by the arm and spun him toward the edge. The crowd screamed in shock as Harry's boots slipped again on the loose gravel. His arms flailed, searching for something, anything, to hold on to. At the last moment, his fingers found a jagged outcrop of rock just below the rim. He clung to it desperately, his muscles straining as pain shot through his hands. Below him yawned the vast, unforgiving void of the canyon, promising certain death if he let go. "Hold on, Mr. Jenkins," Elijah shouted, stepping closer to the edge. "I'm here. I'll get help." Harry's breath came in ragged gasps as he clung to the jagged outcrop. The sharp edges bit into his palms, blood seeping from fresh cuts, but he didn't dare loosen his grip. Below him, the canyon stretched out like an endless, unforgiving chasm, its vastness both majestic and terrifying. The weight of his body pulled relentlessly against his fingers, but his resolve was stronger. Above him, the scene was chaos. Tourists stood frozen in shock, some with hands over their mouths, others fumbling to pull out their phones. Elijah, however, sprang into action. His camera now hung forgotten at his side as he crouched near the edge, his voice steady despite the panic in his eyes. "Mr. Jenkins, just hold on," Elijah called out. "I'll find something to pull you up." Harry's muscles burned with exertion, his grip weakening with every passing second. The sun beat down mercilessly, sweat dripping into his eyes and mixing with the blood on his hands. But his mind was sharp, focused. He had survived worse than this. Jungles filled with ambushes, nights of relentless enemy fire, and the long battles of rebuilding a life after war. He wasn't going to let go now. "Take your time, son," Harry rasped, his voice strained but calm. "I'm not done yet." Behind Elijah, Officer Wilkes stood stiffly, his face a mask of conflicted emotions. For a moment he seemed to falter, his bravado cracking as the gravity of what had just happened settled over him. The crowd wasn't silent anymore. Murmurs of dissent rippled through the group, and more than a few people had started recording on their phones. "You just tried to kill him," one voice rang out, trembling with outrage. "This is a police matter," Wilkes barked, his voice cracking as he pointed a trembling finger at the crowd. "Back off, everyone, stay back." Elijah rose to his feet, his camera now in hand, and pointed squarely at the officer. "A police matter?" he repeated, his tone cutting. "You shoved him off the edge, and now you're trying to pretend you're still in control?" Wilkes' face darkened with anger, his hand instinctively moving to the baton at his hip. "Turn that camera off, or you'll what?" Elijah snapped, his voice rising. "Go ahead, keep digging that hole for yourself. The world's going to see this, and there's nothing you can do to stop it." The crowd began to stir, emboldened by Elijah's defiance. A few voices rose in support of Harry, calling out for Wilkes to back down. The officer's authority was unraveling fast, his once commanding presence eroded by the weight of dozens of watchful eyes and recording devices. Meanwhile, Harry's strength was failing. His fingers, slick with blood, began to slip against the jagged surface of the rock. He gritted his teeth, every muscle in his body screaming in protest as he fought to pull himself upward. "Don't you let go, Mr. Jenkins," Elijah shouted, his voice fierce and determined. With one final surge of effort, Harry swung his legs upward, finding just enough leverage to propel himself back onto solid ground. He collapsed onto the gravel, his chest heaving, his hands trembling and bloodied. The crowd erupted in a wave of relieved cheers, the sound washing over Harry like a balm. Elijah rushed to his side, kneeling next to him and steadying him as he tried to sit up. "You're incredible, Mr. Jenkins," Elijah said, his voice shaky but filled with admiration. "You held on. You didn't let him win." Harry managed a weak smile, his breath still coming in short bursts. "It wasn't just for me," he murmured. "It was for everyone watching." Wilkes, however, wasn't ready to admit defeat. His face was pale, his hands were twitching, and he barked orders at the crowd. "Disperse. This is over." But Elijah stood, his camera trained on the officer. "No, it's not," he said coldly. "This is just the beginning." The murmurs of the crowd grew louder, shifting from fear to anger. Tourists stepped closer, their phones raised high as they captured every second of the confrontation. "You're done, officer," one man shouted. "We all saw what you did." "Justice for Jenkins," someone else called out, their voice cutting through the din. Wilkes took a step back, the weight of the crowd's collective gaze pressing down on him. His hand hovered near his baton, but he didn't dare reach for it. He was cornered, his authority slipping through his fingers like sand. Harry, still seated on the gravel, looked up at Elijah and then at the crowd. Their faces, once filled with indifference, now reflected anger and solidarity. He felt a surge of gratitude but also a heavy responsibility. Struggling to his feet, he raised a hand, his voice steady despite the exhaustion in his body. "Thank you," he said, his words carrying over the noise. "But this fight isn't over. Not yet." The crowd quieted, their attention fixed on him. Harry turned his gaze to Wilkes, his expression calm but resolute. "You want to arrest me?" Harry said. "Go ahead. But you can't silence the truth. Not today." Wilkes hesitated, his jaw tightening as he wrestled with his next move. For a moment, it seemed like he might lash out again. But then, without another word, he turned on his heel and stalked back toward his patrol car. "This isn't over," he muttered under his breath as he climbed into the vehicle. The sound of the car door slamming shut echoed across the canyon, followed by the screech of tires as Wilkes sped away. As the dust settled, the crowd erupted into cheers once more. Strangers approached Harry, offering words of gratitude and admiration. Elijah stood by his side, his camera still rolling, capturing every moment. "You did it," Elijah said, his voice filled with awe. Harry gave a small nod, his face solemn. "We all did. But there's still a long way to go." Looking out over the canyon, Harry felt a mix of exhaustion and triumph. He had come here seeking peace, but instead, he had found a fight. And though he hadn't asked for it, he knew it was a fight worth having. The sun hung high over the Grand Canyon, casting sharp shadows on the gravel lot as the crowd around Harry thickened. The shock of the confrontation with Officer Wilkes had faded, replaced by an electric current of outrage and determination. Elijah stood beside Harry, his camera still trained on the scene as a testament to what had happened. "You're a hero, Mr. Jenkins," someone from the crowd said, their voice shaking with emotion. "Bookmark." Harry straightened, his bloodied hands still trembling, but his gaze steady. "I'm just a man trying to stand up for what's right," he replied, his voice carrying a quiet strength. The tourists who had once kept their distance now stepped closer, forming a loose semicircle around Harry. Some offered him bottled water and tissues for his injuries. Others murmured words of solidarity. Phones were still raised, and the aftermath was recorded and broadcast over the world. The power dynamics of the day had shifted completely. This was no longer a moment of isolation for Harry, but a growing movement for justice. Elijah addressed the crowd, his young face resolute. "If anyone here has footage of what just happened, please share it," he said, raising his voice to be heard over the murmurs. "The world needs to see this." Several people nodded in agreement, holding up their phones as they approached Elijah to exchange contact information. Harry watched as the young journalist handled the moment with calm professionalism, his demeanor both reassuring and inspiring. "Thank you," Elijah said to the group. "Every voice matters in moments like this." One woman, her face flushed with anger, turned to Harry. "That officer should be behind bars for what he did to you," she said. Harry gave a small nod. "Let's hope the system agrees," he replied, his tone measured but weary. As the crowd began to thin, Elijah helped Harry toward a nearby rest area. The walk was slow, Harry's battered body protesting every step, but his pride refused to let him falter. Elijah guided him to a bench near a first aid station, where a park ranger approached with cautious concern. "I heard there was some kind of incident," the ranger said, glancing between Elijah and Harry. "Is everyone okay?" Elijah met the ranger's gaze directly. "There was more than an incident," he replied, his tone clipped. "A police officer just assaulted this man and nearly killed him." The ranger's eyes widened, and he shifted uncomfortably. I'll report this to the authorities," he stammered. "Is there anything I can do right now?" "You can make sure justice is served," Elijah said pointedly, his camera now hanging at his side. The ranger nodded, then excused himself, disappearing toward the park's visitor center. Elijah turned his attention back to Harry, who sat quietly on the bench, his hands now loosely bandaged. Despite his exhaustion, Harry's expression was resolute. "How are you holding up?" Elijah asked, crouching in front of him. Harry looked at the young man, his eyes reflecting decades of trials and triumphs. "I've been through worse," he said simply. "But today reminded me how far we still have to go." Elijah nodded, a flicker of admiration crossing his face. "You're not alone in this, Mr. Jenkins," he said. "The whole world is going to see what happened here." Harry gave a faint smile. "I didn't come here to make a statement," he said. "I just wanted to see the canyon. But if this is what it takes to make people see the truth, then so be it. As they sat together, Elijah pulled out his phone and began drafting a social media post. His fingers moved quickly across the screen, but his words were deliberate and thoughtful. When he finished, he showed it to Harry for approval. The caption read, "Today I witnessed a Vietnam veteran fighting for his life, not in a jungle, but right here in America." Herman Jenkins was assaulted by a police officer while visiting the Grand Canyon simply because he didn't look like he belonged. This is his story. Share it. Make sure the world knows the truth. Harry read the post silently, his lips pressing into a thin line. Finally, he nodded. "If this is what it takes," he said, "then let them see it." Elijah tapped post, and within minutes the video began spreading like wildfire. Comments, shares, and reactions poured in from all corners of the internet. Strangers expressed their outrage, their solidarity, and their commitment to justice. By the time the sun began to dip lower in the sky, the video had reached hundreds of thousands of views. News outlets started picking up the story, and hashtags like #JusticeForJenkins and Veteran Hero began trending on social media. Elijah glanced at his phone, the screen lighting up with notifications. "It's gaining traction," he said, showing Harry the growing view count. Harry nodded, though his expression remained calm. "It's not just about the numbers," he said. "It's about what comes next." As if on cue, Elijah's phone buzzed with an alert. A news anchor's voice filled the air as Elijah played the video. Breaking news. Viral footage shows a police officer assaulting Vietnam veteran Herman Jenkins at the Grand Canyon. Authorities have announced an investigation into the officer's actions, and he has been placed on administrative leave pending further review. Harry exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening. "Administrative leave," he muttered. "That's just a fancy way of saying they're waiting for this to blow over." "Not this time," Elijah said firmly. "Too many people are watching." Meanwhile, the momentum of the growing movement showed no signs of slowing. Protesters began gathering outside the Arizona State Police headquarters, holding signs that read "Justice for Jenkins and Veterans Deserve Respect." The governor released a statement condemning Officer Wilkes' actions and promising a full investigation. More details about Harry's life began surfacing online. Articles about his time in Vietnam, the commendations he had earned for his bravery under fire, and the decades of quiet resilience he had shown after returning home. The contrast between Harry's honorable past and Wilkes' appalling behavior only fueled public outrage. Elijah turned to Harry as they sat quietly on the bench. "You've started something, Mr. Jenkins," he said. Harry's gaze remained fixed on the horizon, where the sun was now painting the canyon in shades of orange and gold. "I didn't start it," he said, "but I'll see it through." The following morning, Harry woke to the sound of his phone buzzing incessantly on the nightstand. For years, his modest flip phone had sat mostly silent, used sparingly for calls with family or an occasional check-in from an old friend. But now, it vibrated with an energy that matched the growing storm outside his small world. When Harry flipped it open, the screen was lit up with text messages and missed calls. He scrolled through the messages, seeing words like hero, justice, and outrage repeatedly. Among them was a voicemail from his daughter, Cheryl. Her voice, calm but tinged with urgency, said, "Dad, I saw the video. Are you okay? Everyone's talking about you. Call me when you can." Harry sighed deeply, running a hand over his face. He had barely processed the events of the previous day, let alone the national attention now centered on his life. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. When Harry opened it, Elijah stood there, a tablet in hand, his expression a mixture of excitement and determination. "Good morning, Mr. Jenkins," Elijah said, stepping inside. "Have you seen the news yet?" Harry shook his head. "Only what people have been sending me," he replied. Elijah tapped on the screen of his tablet and handed it to Harry. A breaking news broadcast played, the headline impossible to miss. "Grand Canyon incident sparks national outrage. Police officer under investigation after viral video." Harry watched silently as the anchor summarized the events. The footage of Wilkes shoving Harry near the canyon's edge played on a loop, accompanied by still images of protesters holding signs demanding justice. The words "decorated Vietnam veteran" appeared prominently on the screen, drawing a stark contrast to Wilkes' actions. "They've put him on administrative leave," Elijah said, his voice tight with frustration. "But the protests are growing. People aren't letting this go. By midday, the storm of public outrage had become impossible to ignore. Across the country, news outlets aired the story, and social media platforms were ablaze with hashtags like "Justice for Jenkins" and "Veterans Deserve Respect." The video Elijah had posted surpassed 1 million views. Its comments section flooded with messages of anger and support. Protests outside the Arizona State Police headquarters grew larger by the hour, with veterans groups, civil rights organizations, and ordinary citizens joining together in solidarity. The air was thick with chants of "Justice for Jenkins" and "End abuse of power." Even Harry's neighbors had taken notice. That afternoon, as he sat on his porch sipping coffee, a young couple from down the street stopped by. "Mr. Jenkins," the man began hesitantly, "we saw the video. What that officer did to you, it was awful. We just wanted to say how much we admire your courage," the woman added. Harry offered a small, polite nod. "Thank you," he said simply. The couple lingered for a moment before departing, their admiration evident. Harry watched them go, the weight of their words settling over him. Later that evening, Elijah returned with an update. "You won't believe this," he said, his voice alive with urgency. "They've arrested Wilkes." Harry raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. "Arrested?" he repeated. "And what did they charge him with?" "Assault and misconduct," Elijah replied. "And it gets worse for him. They're digging into his history. Turns out this isn't the first time he's abused his power." That revelation didn't surprise Harry, but it hardened his resolve. "It's about time," he said quietly. The news spread quickly, fueling even more public anger. Reports surfaced of Wilkes' past behavior, complaints of excessive force and abuse of authority that had gone unpunished for years. Activists called for systemic reform, arguing that Wilkes was a symptom of a much larger problem. Elijah, ever the storyteller, seized the opportunity to dive deeper. "This isn't just about Wilkes," he said. "It's about the culture that allowed him to act like this in the first place. We need to show people the bigger picture." 2 days later, Harry received an invitation to speak at a rally organized in his honor. The thought of standing in front of a crowd sharing his story with strangers made his stomach churn. Public speaking wasn't his forte, and he wasn't seeking fame or recognition. But as he sat quietly in his living room, turning the invitation over in his hands, Elijah's words echoed in his mind. "The world needs to see the truth." Harry sighed deeply. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone who had ever faced the kind of injustice he had endured. He made up his mind. On the day of the rally, the park near the Grand Canyon was packed with people. Veterans in uniform stood shoulder to shoulder with activists and ordinary citizens, their voices united in a call for justice. Signs bearing messages of solidarity filled the air. "Justice for Jenkins, respect our heroes, and end police brutality." Harry stood backstage, his heart pounding as he listened to the chants. Elijah stood beside him, offering a reassuring pat on the shoulder. "You've got this," Elijah said, his voice steady. "Just speak from the heart." Taking a deep breath, Harry stepped onto the stage. The crowd erupted into applause, their energy palpable. For a moment, Harry stood silently at the podium, letting the noise wash over him. Then he raised a hand, and the crowd quieted. "Thank you," Harry began, his voice steady but firm. "Thank you for standing here today. Not just for me, but for every person who has ever been mistreated, overlooked, or silenced." The crowd hung on his every word, their attention unwavering. "I came to the Grand Canyon for peace," he continued. "I wanted to see something beautiful. Something that reminded me of the resilience of this world. But instead, I was reminded of how much work we still have to do." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. "This fight isn't over," he said. "It's not just about one man or one moment. It's about justice. It's about making sure no one else has to go through what I did. And I believe we can do it. Together." The applause was deafening, a wave of solidarity washing over the park. Harry stepped back from the podium, his heart heavy but hopeful. For the first time, he felt that his voice mattered, that his story had the power to inspire real change. The rally marked a turning point, but it was far from the end of Harry's journey. The crowd's thunderous applause still echoed in his ears as he stepped down from the stage. A wave of people approached, many of them veterans like himself, offering handshakes, hugs, and words of solidarity. "You've given us all hope, Harry," one man said, gripping Harry's hand tightly. What you've done here, it matters. It really does. Harry nodded, his expression solemn. It's not just for me, he replied. It's for everyone who's ever been made to feel like they don't belong. Elijah stood nearby, his camera capturing the heartfelt interactions. He had posted updates throughout the rally, each one garnering hundreds of thousands of likes and shares. The momentum showed no signs of slowing. By the next morning, the viral storm surrounding the Grand Canyon incident had grown even stronger. News outlets across the country dedicated airtime to Harry's story, and interviews with witnesses who had been on the tour bus revealed more damning details about Wilkes's behavior. The officer's history of complaints was scrutinized in depth, with journalists exposing a pattern of unchecked abuse that stretched back years. Elijah had spent the evening compiling a detailed timeline for his next social media post, carefully laying out the systemic issues that had allowed Wilkes to remain in uniform. As he sat with Harry in the quiet of his living room, he shared his draft. "This is more than just your story now, Mr. Jenkins," Elijah explained. "It's about accountability. If Wilkes isn't held responsible, it sends a message that this kind of behavior is acceptable." Harry read the post slowly, his weathered hands resting on the tablet. The words painted a clear picture of systemic failure, but also carried a call to action. Justice for Harry Jenkins isn't just about one man, it's about ensuring that no one else has to endure what he did. Together, we can demand accountability, reform, and a brighter future. "You've got away with words," Harry said, handing the tablet back to Elijah. "Make sure they understand what's at stake." As the days passed, the pressure on local authorities intensified. Protests outside the Arizona State Police headquarters swelled to unprecedented numbers. Activists and veterans organizations joined forces, demanding not only justice for Harry but also sweeping reforms within law enforcement. The governor, faced with mounting public outcry, issued a statement promising a thorough investigation and swift action. "The events that occurred at the Grand Canyon are unacceptable," she said during a televised address. "We owe it to Mr. Jenkins and the people of this state to ensure that justice is served." Her words were a step in the right direction, but Harry remained cautious. He had seen promises like these before, well-meaning but often short-lived. A few days later, Elijah burst through the door of Harry's home, practically vibrating with excitement. "Mr. Jenkins, you're not going to believe this," Elijah said, holding up his phone. "They've expedited Wilkes's trial. It's happening next week." Harry's eyebrows lifted slightly, his expression a mixture of surprise and skepticism. "That fast, huh?" Elijah nodded. "The pressure's too high for them to delay. And it's not just the trial, there's already talk of new policies being implemented across the state." Harry leaned back in his chair, his hands resting on the arms of the worn fabric. "Talk is cheap," he said. "Let's see what they actually do." The trial became a national spectacle. Cameras weren't allowed in the courtroom, but reporters lined the courthouse steps, relaying every detail to a captivated public. Harry, dressed in a simple suit with his military medals pinned to his chest, sat quietly in the gallery. His presence was understated but powerful, a living reminder of the incident that had sparked the trial. Elijah sat beside him, his camera left behind for once. "Today isn't about capturing footage," he had told Harry. "It's about witnessing justice." The prosecutor's opening statement was direct and uncompromising. "This is not just a case of excessive force," she declared. "This is a case of abuse of power, fueled by prejudice, carried out against a man who has served this country with honor." Wilkes's defense team tried to argue that the officer had acted under stress and made an unfortunate misjudgment, but the evidence, the video footage, the eyewitness accounts, and the pattern of past complaints painted a far darker picture. When it was Harry's turn to testify, the courtroom fell silent. He stood slowly, his posture straight despite the weight of the moment, and walked to the witness stand. The prosecutor's voice was respectful as she began. "Mr. Jenkins, can you tell us what happened that day?" Harry took a deep breath before speaking. His voice was calm but resolute as he recounted the events at the canyon. From the first interaction with Wilkes to the terrifying moment when he clung to the edge for his life. He described the humiliation, the fear, and the resilience that had carried him through. "I faced enemies in war," he said, his voice steady. "I know what it means to fight. But that day, I didn't come to fight. I came for peace. And instead, I was treated like I didn't belong. Like my life didn't matter. The weight of his words hung in the air, moving many in the room to tears. The trial lasted several days, each moment dissected by the public and media alike. Outside the courthouse, protesters continued to gather, their chants echoing through the streets. Social media remained ablaze, with millions following every update. Finally, the jury delivered its verdict, guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted in a mix of relief and satisfaction as the judge announced Wilkes' sentence, significant prison time, and the stripping of his badge and pension. For many, it was a small but meaningful step toward accountability. As Harry left the courthouse, he was met by a sea of supporters. The crowd roared with applause, their voices a thunderous wave of gratitude and admiration. Elijah stood nearby, capturing the moment on his camera. Harry raised a hand to quiet the crowd. "Thank you," he said, his voice strong despite the exhaustion in his eyes. "This wasn't just about me. It was about all of us. About saying no to hate and yes to justice." The applause swelled once more as Harry stepped away, his heart heavy but hopeful. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time in a long while, he felt that real change was within reach. The trial's conclusion sent shockwaves through the country. The guilty verdict for Officer Wilkes wasn't just about one man being held accountable. It was a symbol of what was possible when voices united against injustice. Across social media, posts about Harry Jenkins' story continued to trend. Major news outlets aired segments reflecting on the broader implications, while commentators hailed the trial as a landmark moment for justice and police accountability. Bookmark. For Harry, however, the aftermath of the trial was both overwhelming and bittersweet. He had come to the Grand Canyon in search of peace, but instead, his life had become the center of a national conversation. Letters and emails poured in from strangers thanking him for his courage. Fellow veterans reached out to share their own stories of prejudice and resilience, offering solidarity. One letter stood out. It was from a young man who had seen Elijah's video. "Mr. Jenkins, I'm a black teenager in a small town. I've always felt like my voice didn't matter. But when I saw what you did, how you stood up to that officer and refused to back down, I realized I could fight for myself too. Thank you for showing me what strength looks like." Harry read the letter twice, his hands trembling slightly as he folded it neatly and placed it on his kitchen table. It wasn't often that he allowed himself to feel pride, but in that moment, he felt the weight of his journey lift, if only a little. Meanwhile, Elijah's efforts to document Harry's story bore fruit in ways even he hadn't anticipated. His posts had gone viral, but his work wasn't limited to social media. He had begun editing a documentary chronicling the events, weaving together footage of the Grand Canyon confrontation, interviews with witnesses, and powerful reflections from Harry himself. One afternoon, Elijah visited Harry's home with a special delivery. "I wanted you to have the first copy," Elijah said, handing Harry a sleek DVD case. The title read. Below the title was an image of Harry, standing resolutely at the canyon's edge, his expression one of quiet strength. Harry turned the case over in his hands, its weight feeling heavier than it should. "I'm not much for watching myself on a screen," he said with a faint smile. Elijah chuckled. "This isn't just about you, Mr. Jenkins. It's about what you represent. People need to see this. They need to know that standing up matters." Harry set the DVD down carefully, nodding. "You've got a good head on your shoulders, Elijah. Don't lose that. The world needs more people like you." As the documentary gained attention, the calls for reform intensified. Activists used Harry's story to push for changes in law enforcement practices, particularly around de-escalation training and accountability for officers with histories of misconduct. Town hall meetings and community forums were held across the country, with Harry's name often mentioned as an example of perseverance in the face of systemic failure. Even politicians began to take notice. The governor of Arizona announced new statewide initiatives aimed at improving police oversight, including mandatory body cameras and an independent review board for officer misconduct cases. During a press conference, she acknowledged the role Harry's story had played in sparking these changes. "Mr. Jenkins' courage has reminded us all of the need to protect the dignity and safety of every individual," she said. Harry watched the press conference from his living room, his expression unreadable. Elijah sat beside him, phone in hand, ready to record Harry's reaction. "What do you think?" Elijah asked. Harry sipped his coffee slowly, his gaze fixed on the screen. "It's a start," he said finally. "But a few speeches and policies won't fix what's broken. That's going to take time, and people will be willing to keep fighting." As the weeks passed, Elijah's documentary premiered at a local theater, drawing a packed house. Harry was reluctant to attend, but Elijah convinced him. "This is your story," he said. "You need to see how it's impacting people." The theater buzzed with energy as the audience settled into their seats. Veterans, activists, and everyday citizens filled the room, their faces alight with anticipation. When the lights dimmed, the opening scenes of the documentary played across the screen, the vast expanse of the Grand Canyon, followed by the harrowing footage of Wilkes shoving Harry toward the edge. The audience gasped, their collective tension palpable. But as the documentary unfolded, detailing Harry's life, his resilience, and the aftermath of the incident, the mood shifted. By the time the credits rolled, the room was filled with a heavy, reflective silence. When the lights came back on, the audience erupted into applause. People stood, clapping and cheering, their admiration directed at Harry, who sat quietly in the back row. Elijah leaned over and whispered, "They're here because of you." Harry shook his head slightly. "They're here because of what we all stood for," he replied. The documentary's success went far beyond that theater. It was picked up by streaming platforms, reaching millions of viewers across the country. Film critics praised it for its raw honesty and emotional depth, with many calling it a must-watch for anyone concerned about justice and equality. For Elijah, the experience was life-changing. The young journalist found himself at the center of discussions about activism and storytelling, invited to speak at universities and conferences about the power of media to drive social change. But he never lost sight of the man who had inspired it all. "Mr. Jenkins," Elijah said during one of his visits, "you've changed my life. You've shown me what it means to stand for something bigger than yourself." Harry gave him a faint smile. "And you've reminded me that the fight's never really over. But with people like you out there, I know it's in good hands." As Harry's story continued to ripple across the nation, he finally found a moment of quiet reflection. One evening, he returned to the Grand Canyon, not as a tourist, but as an honored guest. This time, he wasn't alone. Elijah, along with a small group of friends and supporters, joined him. They stood together at the edge of the canyon, the sun setting in a blaze of orange and purple, casting its light over the vast expanse. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Elijah said softly. Harry nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "It is, and it's a reminder. No matter how deep the darkness, there's always light." The group fell into a comfortable silence, the wind carrying their thoughts across the canyon. For Harry, the journey had come full circle. The scars on his hands and heart were still there, but they were marks of a battle won, not just for himself, but for everyone who dared to fight for what was right. The days after Harry's return to the Grand Canyon were quieter, but no less significant. While the public momentum surrounding his story remained strong, Harry himself retreated to the comfort of his modest home, trying to find peace after weeks of relentless attention. Yet his impact rippled far beyond the confines of his porch. Bookmark: the state of Arizona officially implemented sweeping reforms to its policing system. A newly established oversight board began investigating officers with histories of misconduct, and mandatory training programs focused on de-escalation and bias reduction were rolled out statewide. Local law enforcement agencies, pressured by public scrutiny, issued statements acknowledging the systemic flaws that had allowed officers like Wilkes to act with impunity. For Harry, these changes were encouraging, but he knew they were only the first steps. He had spent decades watching promises of progress fizzle out, and while he was heartened by the reforms, he remained cautious. "They've made a start," he told Elijah during one of their regular visits. "But now it's up to people like you and all those protesters out there to make sure they keep going." Harry's cautious optimism was shared by the many activists who had rallied around his story. Across the country, his name became synonymous with resilience and accountability. Communities held town halls and forums, using his experience as a springboard to discuss broader issues of justice and equality. Schools invited him to speak to young audiences, who listened in awe as he recounted not just his confrontation at the canyon, but also the lessons he had learned over a lifetime of service and struggle. One such event took place at a local high school, where Harry addressed a gymnasium filled with students. He spoke plainly, his words carrying the weight of someone who had seen both the best and worst of humanity. "I didn't ask to be in the spotlight," he told them, his voice steady. "But sometimes life puts you in a position where you have to stand up, not just for yourself, but for what's right. You all have that power, too. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." The students erupted into applause, their enthusiasm a reminder to Harry of the importance of reaching the next generation. Meanwhile, Elijah's documentary continued to make waves. It was nominated for and later won several prestigious awards, including Best Documentary at an influential film festival. During his acceptance speech, Elijah dedicated the honor to Harry and to everyone who had ever fought for justice in the face of adversity. "This story isn't just about one man," Elijah said on stage, his voice filled with conviction. "It's about all of us. It's about the courage to stand up and say, 'Enough is enough.'" Elijah's success opened doors for him, but he remained deeply connected to Harry. They continued to meet regularly, sharing coffee and conversations about the ongoing fight for justice. Elijah often sought Harry's perspective on new projects, valuing the older man's wisdom and unflinching honesty. One day, several months after the trial, Harry received a call from the governor's office. A formal ceremony was being planned to honor his bravery and to announce additional reforms inspired by his story. The event would include not only state officials, but also national figures who had taken an interest in the movement Harry had inadvertently sparked. At first, Harry hesitated. He had never sought recognition, and the idea of standing before another crowd filled him with unease. But Elijah, ever the voice of encouragement, urged him to reconsider. "You've come this far, Mr. Jenkins," Elijah said. "This isn't just about recognition. It's about showing people that their voices can lead to real change." After some thought, Harry agreed. "If it helps keep the pressure on," he said, "I'll do it." The ceremony was held in the Grand Hall of the state capitol, a space filled with hundreds of people. Veterans, activists, community leaders, and ordinary citizens gathered to celebrate the progress that had been made and to honor Harry's role in bringing about that change. As Harry walked onto the stage, wearing a crisp suit with his military medals pinned to his chest, the crowd rose to their feet in a standing ovation. The applause was thunderous, echoing through the hall as Harry approached the podium. For a moment he stood silently, his weathered face reflecting the weight of the journey that had brought him there. Then he began to speak. "I've never been a man of many words," Harry said, his voice steady, "but I've lived long enough to see this country at its best and its worst. What happened to me at the Grand Canyon, what happened in that moment, should never happen to anyone. And yet it does. Far too often." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the audience. "But what I've learned is that justice isn't something we're given. It's something we fight for. And I'm proud to have fought for it, not just for myself, but for everyone who's ever been treated as less than they deserve." The crowd erupted into applause, many in the audience wiping away tears. Harry stepped back from the podium, his heart heavy but hopeful. He knew the fight wasn't over, but for the first time, he felt that real progress was within reach. In the weeks that followed, the reforms announced at the ceremony began to take shape. Police departments across Arizona implemented mandatory body cameras, community outreach programs, and stricter accountability measures for officers accused of misconduct. While the changes were far from perfect, they marked a significant step forward. Elijah continued to document the ripple effects of Harry's story, interviewing activists, community leaders, and everyday citizens who had been inspired by his courage. His work ensured that the conversation didn't fade, keeping the pressure on those in power to follow through on their promises. For Harry, life slowly returned to a quieter rhythm. He spent his days tending to his small garden, reading letters from supporters, and reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this point. Though the scars on his hands were a constant reminder of the confrontation at the canyon, they no longer felt like marks of pain. Instead, they were symbols of survival and of a battle won. One evening, as the sun set over his quiet neighborhood, Harry sat on his porch with a cup of coffee in hand. The air was still, and worlds around him were peaceful. For the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of closure. He knew the fight for justice would continue long after he was gone, but he also knew that he had played his part. And that, he thought, was enough. Months passed, and the storm surrounding Harry Jenkins' story began to settle, though its effects continued to reverberate across the nation. The reforms inspired by his ordeal were implemented not just in Arizona, but in other states as well. Grassroots organizations cited his story as a rallying cry for justice and accountability, sparking conversations that extended far beyond law enforcement. Bookmark. For Harry, however, life moved back toward simplicity. The days were quieter now, and he spent them tending to the small garden in his backyard, reading letters of support and sharing stories with those who visited him. Though he never sought to be a hero, he accepted the role that life had thrust upon him with grace. One cool autumn morning, Elijah arrived at Harry's home with another update. "Mr. Jenkins," he began, holding a glossy magazine. "Have you seen this?" Harry adjusted his glasses as Elijah handed him the publication. On the cover was a photo of Harry standing at the Grand Canyon, his expression resolute, with the headline, "One Man's Fight for Justice, How Harry Jenkins Sparked a Movement." Harry let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "Never thought I'd see my face in a magazine," he said. Elijah grinned. "Well, you earned it. People need stories like yours to remind them what's possible." The article detailed Harry's journey, from the quiet man who boarded the tour bus that fateful day to the national figure who had become a symbol of resilience. It celebrated not just his courage, but also the ripple effects his story had created, a wave of accountability, reforms, and hope. Harry handed the magazine back to Elijah. "It's nice," he said, "but the real work's still out there. It's just a reminder." One of the most significant moments of closure came when Harry was invited to a special commemoration at the Grand Canyon. The National Park Service had organized the event to honor him, not just for what had happened there, but for the broader impact he had made. When Harry arrived, he was greeted by familiar faces. Elijah, now a rising star in journalism, the park rangers who had supported him after the incident, and even a few of the tourists from that fateful tour group who had stood by him. The ceremony was simple but poignant. A plaque was unveiled at the site where the confrontation had occurred, bearing the inscription, "In honor of Herman Harry Jenkins, a veteran of resilience, courage, and justice. Let this place remind us all of the strength it takes to stand up for what is right." Harry stood quietly, his hands clasped in front of him, as the crowd applauded. When he stepped forward to speak, the canyon seemed to hold its breath. "I didn't come to this place looking for trouble," he began, his voice steady but reflective. "I came here for peace. For years I dreamed of standing at this edge and seeing the beauty of it all. And I did, just not in the way I expected." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "This canyon? It's a reminder of how vast the world is, how small we are, and how much courage it takes to stand up when the ground beneath us feels like it's falling away. I'm grateful to all of you for standing with me, for making sure this story wasn't forgotten. But remember this, the fight for justice doesn't stop here. It's something we have to carry with us every day." The crowd erupted in applause, their cheers echoing across the canyon walls. Elijah stood off to the side, capturing the moment on his camera, a smile of pride on his face. As the ceremony concluded, Harry lingered at the edge of the canyon, gazing out at the vast expanse. The sun was beginning to set, casting the rocks in shades of orange and gold. He felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years, a quiet certainty that, despite the struggles, his journey had been worth it. Elijah approached, standing beside him. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he said softly. Harry nodded. "It is. Makes you realize how small we are in the grand scheme of things. But even the smallest actions can make a big difference," Elijah added, his tone thoughtful. Harry smiled faintly. "That's true, and it's something worth remembering." Over the following months, Harry continued to receive letters from people across the country. One came from a woman in Georgia who had been inspired to run for city council after seeing his story. Another came from a veteran who had been struggling with PTSD but found hope in Harry's resilience. Each letter reminded Harry of the power of one voice, amplified by the courage of many. Elijah, too, carried the lessons of their shared journey into his future projects. His work remained focused on uncovering untold stories of justice and perseverance, and he often credited Harry as his greatest inspiration. "Meeting you changed everything for me," Elijah told Harry during one of their visits. "You taught me that journalism isn't just about telling stories. It's about making sure those stories lead to something bigger." Harry chuckled. "You had it in you all along, son. I just gave you a push." Years later, Elijah would go on to produce a second documentary, a follow-up to Harry's story, highlighting the ongoing reforms and the lives that had been changed as a result. By then, Harry had become something of a living legend, though he always downplayed the attention. "I didn't do anything special," he often said. "I just didn't let them push me off that edge." One evening, as the sun set over his quiet neighborhood, Harry sat alone on his porch, sipping coffee and watching the world grow still. The scars on his hands were faint now, but he often traced them absent-mindedly, remembering the canyon and all that had come after. The wind carried a soft, comforting breeze, and for the first time in a long while, Harry allowed himself to smile, a deep, contented smile. He had come to the canyon seeking peace, and though the journey had taken him through trials he never expected, he had found what he was looking for. And in the end, he knew his story had left the world just a little better than he had found it. Harry Jenkins' story is more than just a tale of resilience. It's a testament to the human spirit's ability to rise against adversity and demand change. From the brink of tragedy at the Grand Canyon to becoming a symbol of justice and accountability, Harry's journey reminds us that even in the face of overwhelming odds, courage can spark movements, and one voice can ripple into a chorus of solidarity. Bookmark. The video encapsulating Harry's ordeal and triumph serves as a powerful mirror to our society. It forces us to confront the deep-rooted inequities that persist while inspiring us to believe in the possibility of change. Through his unwavering dignity, Harry taught us that the fight for justice is ongoing, but it is a fight worth pursuing. The lesson here is clear. Justice isn't automatic. It requires action, unity, and the willingness to stand firm, even when the ground beneath you feels uncertain. Harry didn't seek recognition, but his story became a beacon, proving that when we come together to hold those in power accountable, we can shape a better, more just world for everyone. This isn't just Harry's story, it's our story. It's about what happens when ordinary people refuse to be silenced and demand that dignity and respect be extended to all. His journey serves as a reminder that while the road to justice may be long, the destination is always worth it. If this story moves you, we want to hear your thoughts. Was it inspiring? If you thought the story was good, comment with a 1. If you thought it was amazing, comment with a 2. Share your own experiences in the comments below. We believe everyone has a story worth telling. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to ensure you don't miss the meaningful stories we'll be sharing in the future. Let us know what you thought of Harry Jenkins' journey, and join the conversation. Together, we can continue to amplify voices that matter.